My name is Murray Hiebert. I work on Southeast Asia here at CSIS. However, that's not how I am here today. I'm just here because I work at CSIS and I have the honor of hosting our guest. We're in for a real treat, I think. Our guest is Adam Brookes. Adam was a long-time correspondent for the BBC in China. And about 10 or 12 years ago, he moved to Washington with his wife Susan Susan Lawrence and I were colleagues, and that's how I met Adam, so it's been a pleasure. Then last year, Adam came out with his first novel, Night Heron, which is set in China and introduced readers to the, oh boy. That's good luck. That's good, there you go. So it introduced readers to the adventures of a British journalist who got ensnared in a spy network. And then more recently, and just in recent weeks, Adam's second spy thriller, Spy Games, which I guess you probably all have seen at least the picture of in the invitation, which has the journalist moving beyond China and being in Ethiopia, and later gets caught in Thailand and Myanmar, and that's why I'm actually hosting the event. But National Public Radio named Night Heron last year as one of the best books of 2014, and this year has already named Spy Games as one of the best books of 2015. So congratulations on that, Adam. So our format today will be rather simple. Adam will talk a little bit about his book and some of the things, some of the research he did for the book, and then I'll ask him a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to the floor for you to ask questions. So Adam, thanks for coming, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to CSIS and to Murray and to Brandon Schwartz for organizing this event, and thank you very much indeed for coming. Back when I was the Beijing correspondent for the BBC, and this is going back about 10 years now, I was in the BBC bureau in Beijing on a Sunday afternoon. It was a quiet day. I was on weekend call duty. It was my turn. I was just about to log off the computer and go home when there was a knock at the door. I went to answer it, and there was an elderly gentleman standing there in a flat cap and a blue zhongshanzhuang, what we would call a Mao jacket in English. And he was carrying a little black plastic briefcase. I opened the door, and he said that he urgently needed to speak to a BBC correspondent. We were normally leery of people turning up at the bureau like that because there's a lot of untreated mental illness in China. And foreign bureaus were a magnet for people who believed that they were having their brainwaves controlled by the BBC and whatever. That day I let this gentleman in, and I sat him down and asked him what it was he wanted. And he reached into his little briefcase and he pulled out 2 secret documents, Chinese government secret documents. They weren't at a very high level of classification. They were Neibu, which is the lowest level of government classification. But they were certainly something that a foreign journalist shouldn't be looking at. I took a quick look at them and handed them back to him and thanked him, but told him it was not a good idea that he pass these materials to me. But he was very insistent, and he told me that he had a lot more of these documents that he wanted to pass to me, and I said that I really didn't feel it was a good idea, because we were both breaking the law by even considering doing so. But he was very persistent. He called the bureau several times, and then he came back again 2 weeks later and again knocked on the door and told me this time that he had information on what he called experimental satellite launches and information on Chinese re-entry technology. And he wanted to be introduced to what he called the right people at the British Embassy. Now, even somebody as ignorant as me knew that he was talking about the Chinese missile program. He was talking about military secrets. And he seemed to be saying that he wanted to be put in touch with British intelligence. Something that I would not have even known how to do, even if I had wanted to. At this point, of course, I just pulled the shutters down and I insisted that he leave the building and never contact me again. Now, I'm pretty sure that this was a provocation of some kind. It's not that uncommon for foreign journalists to be offered compromising materials by the security services of a host country, just to see if they'll bite. But in my own mind, I couldn't quite leave the story behind, and I kept thinking about it as the months went by and then the years went by. And I found myself thinking about this elderly gentleman and wondering who he was. And I found myself asking not the journalist's question about him, who, what, when, where, why. I found myself asking the novelist's question about him, which is, what if? What if he were real? What if he really was a walk-in? What if he really did want to contact the UK Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, usually referred to as MI6, but the proper name is SIS? Do such people exist in the real world? Do they do that? Do they do that in China? Does it ever happen? What would happen to you if you tried to do that? Out of this experience grew the story that became my first novel, Night Heron, which came out in 2014, in which a frustrated and angry Chinese aerospace engineer tries to contact British intelligence through a British journalist. In Night Heron, this British journalist, a restless, vain man named Philip Mangan, makes the terrible error of not turning the man away and ends up being drawn into a British espionage operation against China with all that entails. I wanted Night Heron to imagine how we might spy on China, and so I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out anything at all of how contemporary espionage operations actually work, which of course as an outsider is all but impossible. Though with the help of the new discipline of intelligence studies, which is taking off now in universities here and in the UK, and with court papers from spy cases, and from the findings of official inquiries, particularly inquiries like the Butler inquiry in the UK, the writer stands some chance, a little chance, of gleaning a few fragments which can then provide the basis of his imaginings. I took a couple of well-known spy cases, American ones, for which you can read the indictments, the wonderful FBI indictments that give you colossal amounts of detail. And I played around with them and I mashed them up. I'm not going to tell you which ones. I'll leave you to figure out which they are. And I'm sure there are people in this room who know them very well. I welcome all comments and contributions on verisimilitude, incidentally. The publisher said that they wanted my second book to be a sequel to Night Heron. So I had written Night Heron originally as a standalone novel. So I had to then unpick the end of Night Heron. I had to bring people back to life. I had to rewrite the whole thing, unresolve their resolutions, reverse their redemptions left and right, and leave the whole thing hanging and open it up for a sequel. And at this time, of course, I had a huge problem because my central character from Night Heron, Philip Mangan, my journalist come spy, is blown in China. So obviously he can't go back to China. So my milieu for my spy novel suddenly disappears. I've got nowhere to put him. So what to do? I decided that I would look at Chinese power pushing out into the world. And this would create a milieu in which Philip Mangan could credibly move. So I decided to go to Africa, and I decided to go to East Africa, and specifically to Ethiopia, to see if I could find any evidence of a Chinese presence there that would illustrate this idea of China making its presence felt on the African continent in new and significant ways. I chose Ethiopia partly because it's easy to get to and it's easy to move around in. But I also chose it because it has very few natural resources. And so Chinese activity in Ethiopia is not centered on the extractive industries like it is in many other African countries. Something else is going on in Ethiopia. Now, I approach this subject as a novelist, not as a researcher, so all my findings are very peremptory and very subjective. This is not any kind of quantitative survey of China's activities in Ethiopia. But what I found there was very, very intriguing and very exciting to me. I have some photographs. That explains why this completely unconnected photograph is sitting up here. I have some slides I just wanted to show you to give you a quick sense of what China is doing in Ethiopia. And then I wanted to talk about how I kind of imagined that into my second novel. What you see here is a scene from the Mercato, which is the biggest market in the center of Addis Ababa, and it's the largest open-air market in Africa. Everything that you see in that picture is manufactured in China and sold in Ethiopia. As you would expect, all the fast-moving consumer goods in this vast market are manufactured in China. The guys selling them are not Chinese. Ethiopia has been very, very careful at keeping Chinese merchants out at the retail level. So you're not seeing Chinese businessmen moving in and taking over local economies like you are in some other African countries. Vast quantities of Chinese imports are marketed and distributed by Ethiopians for Ethiopians. And you know that Chinese garment industry has arrived, and Chinese street fashion has arrived when you see a sweatshirt with that printed on it. Anybody who has spent any time in China will know what I mean by that. All over Addis Ababa, all over everywhere I traveled in Ethiopia, you see signs like this by the side of the road. Everything from water projects to road projects to dam projects to engineering projects, all over the place, evidence of large infrastructure projects funded by China, overseen by China, managed by China, built by China. This one was in Addis Ababa. This is for the light rail system, mass transit system that has been built by China, financed by China in Addis Ababa. It's the only mass transit light rail system in Africa and the Middle East, with the exception of Tunis, and a new one that's being built in Abuja in Nigeria. So Addis Ababa is really singling itself out here. This is part of the construction right in the center of the city where it starts going underground. Massive overground light rail construction as well, running from one side of the city right the way to the other. And there's the finished thing. It's just opened up a few months ago. That is what Addis Ababa's Chinese-built light rail system now looks like. That is the headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa. Built by the Chinese as a gift to the African continent. It's a $200 million building. Looks like something straight out of Shanghai. It's technologically very advanced, we're told. It's wired and networked. But local Ethiopian property management was unable to come up with enough expertise to keep the building running. So right next to the African Union headquarters, you'll see this compound, if you can make it out behind that fence, low-slung white buildings with blue roofs. These buildings house a cadre of Chinese technicians who now live permanently in Addis Ababa and keep the African Union headquarters running. When you talk to Ethiopian security types, they will joke that, of course, China is now monitoring every single syllable uttered inside the African Union headquarters. But they will also joke that any Chinese listener tasked with translating and interpreting and analyzing the proceedings of the African Union will be bored to death or bored into insensibility so quickly that their efforts will be frustrated. They said that, not me. Back one. That's a Chinese hospital built in about 6 months just outside Addis Ababa. Multi-million-dollar building, again, staffed by a permanent cadre of Chinese doctors now for the Ethiopian elite. These are residential dormitories where Chinese engineers live. You can see the slogan up there reads 平等互利合作双赢 through equality, mutual profit, and cooperation. Both sides are victors. Wherever you go, there's enormous emphasis on equality and cooperation. China seeks to portray itself as an equal partner with Ethiopia, not as any kind of paternalistic new neo-colonialist presence, as it is often portrayed. Rattling on quickly, this is a new industrial zone built just outside Addis Ababa. 11 vast hangar-like factory facilities. It's called the Eastern Industrial Zone. Inside, this is what you find. Huajian Group, an enormous garment and shoe manufacturer, has built a shoe factory inside one of these hangars, employing 2,000 Ethiopians. When this place is running at full tilt, it's supposed to employ 50,000 Ethiopians in garment processing, auto parts, agricultural processing. The place was extremely well organized, very, very clean, very disciplined, extremely well managed. This was a training class. They have a 2-week training. New Ethiopian employees have a 2-week induction where their English is brought up to scratch, and they have a week on corporate values and corporate principles before getting training on the machinery in the shoe factory. And when we walked into the room, this chap here on the left who was giving me a lecture gave a signal, and the whole staff stood up and applauded. We had a little proper Chinese applause welcome. So what struck me about this was it seemed to me that Huajian was trying to build a well-disciplined, loyal, well-trained workforce with high levels of productivity. This was not just some gym crack, garment, low-cost manufacturing investment. The railways. This was the beautiful railway built from Addis Ababa to Djibouti by the French at the turn of the 20th century. It died about 10 years ago. It stopped functioning. That's what's left of it now. Except that between the time I took that photograph 2 years ago and now, the entire railway line has been refurbished by China. I think it's 600 kilometers to the sea. And Addis Ababa is once more linked by rail to the sea. And Chinese-funded and Chinese-built railway projects in Ethiopia now add up to 5,000 kilometers of railway that they're building throughout the country. There you can see the sign telling you that's what's about to happen. And it has happened incredibly quickly. It enables the Ethiopians to unload grain, particularly in these famine-struck areas and drought-struck areas, to move grain very, very quickly into the heartland of the country in ways that they couldn't even a couple of years ago. So, obviously there are big strategic and infrastructural implications for everything that China's doing. When you ask Ethiopians about what China's doing in Ethiopia, they reply with a mixture of astonishment and suspicion. The most thoughtful people I talked to seemed sure that China was engaged in a power play in Ethiopia, that it sought to demonstrate its soft power capabilities to an African audience in a strategically very significant country. If you need any proof of China's strategic interest in East Africa, you only need to look at the fact that Djibouti and China have just signed an agreement for a 10-year military basing facility in Djibouti, which we think will be China's first overseas military base. All this is great grist to the spy novelist's mill. And for spy games, I set about imagining a story in which developing countries are areas of strategic contestation in new and surprising ways. Today's contestation, I'll suggest to you, I do suggest in spy games, is about who in the world can use capital and infrastructure investment, and particularly investment in information infrastructure, as the underpinning of strong new strategic bonds between countries. Ethiopia has a population of 95 million people. In 2006, 900,000 of them were using a cell phone. Today, that number is nearly 30 million, and all the cell phones are Chinese, and all the fiber and all the microwave links are Chinese. About a third of spy games takes place in Ethiopia, and then the action moves to Southeast Asia, much of it in Thailand. But I was also thinking about those strange spaces along China's border with Myanmar, which over the years have given rise to many lurid stories about drugs and casinos, and about little ungoverned spaces where the normal rules don't apply. And in spy games, I imagine one of these spaces existing in the gap between China and Myanmar, where law and normality can be suspended for nefarious ends. I'm very intrigued by this idea that there can exist places outside the nation-state system that can generate their own climates of politics and commerce and behavior. And that, of course, is great grist to the spy novelist mill, too. But in the end, my Ethiopia, my Southeast Asia, and my characters, my Philip Mangan, these are all figments of my imagination, and so is the world that they all inhabit. The role of fiction, I would suggest, is not to provide the reader with a documentary account of the world. It's to create an imagined world and to invite you, the reader, to step into it and to consider what you find there. The fiction writer's invitation to the reader goes something like, how would it be if the world were like this? And the fiction writer's hope, or at least this fiction writer's hope, is that when you consider these imagined landscapes, you might take on some fresh perspective or some fresh frame through which to see the real world, and all the while you're having fun and being entertained. Spy fiction, I think, is a particularly good vehicle for this, because good spy fiction invites you, by definition, to consider statecraft and strategy. It asks you to think about your contract with the state, about when you must keep the secrets of the state and when and why you might betray them, and when the state can know your secrets. It asks you to think about the contract you have with the people that you love, and when you might lie to them, and when you might betray them. Espionage fiction explores our feeling that the betrayal of trust is one of the greatest of crimes, and yet such betrayals are carried out daily for advantage and for profit. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I'm going to hand it over to Mary.
Thanks, Adam. That was really fascinating, and helped us to get a bit of a handle on how you went to what you were trying to do and how you went about it. Now, you said after you did Night Heron, the publisher came back and said, "Can you do a sequel?" And you had to figure out, which people to bring back to life and all that stuff.
It was more sort of, you will do a sequel. It was expressed more in those terms than
so were you more cautious in ending Spy Games so that you do have an entry point to do another sequel?
Yes, I'm afraid that the end of Spy Games, if you've read it, you'll see that there is a clanging great cliffhanger, which is designed purely with the purpose of the third book. It's supposed to be a trilogy, and hopefully Little Brown will be agreeing with me the terms for this third book in the coming weeks.
And do you have any? Can you give us any clues as to does it move? Where does it move next? You've done Africa, and then China, Africa.
Well, so it gets harder and harder. So again, with the enthusiasm of the publisher, much of it will be based here. The British market. The lead publisher is British. I have an American publisher and a British publisher, but the lead publisher is in the UK, and they get to set the tone for the whole series. They're very interested in books about America. They always are. So much of book number 3 will be set in the United States. I'm going to add some intrigue set in the Caribbean, particularly in Suriname, which is a country that has a very large and very old Chinese community, but has seen a great deal of Chinese immigration in the last few years. And I think it's a very interesting little place. Spy Games deals a lot with also the thought of international tax havens and the web of secrecy jurisdictions, particularly run by the United Kingdom around the world, masquerading as small countries, with wonderful British flags and lots of ceremony and pomp. Spy Games looks at this, and I intend to draw that out, the Caribbean angle of it out further in the third book. Of course, this is wonderful for moving money around for spies. So.
You know, as a journalist in China, a lot of people come out of China, journalists come out of China, and they do books on the economy or Communist Party or some social problem. But you chose not to do a sort of a description of China, but rather do a spy novel. Like, what is it about you? I mean, is it an easy transition for a journalist?
Discipline.
But is it pretty easy to transition from, or is it's a totally different exercise?
It was a much bigger transition than I thought it was going to be. I discovered that I'm one of a large cadre of kind of middle-aged journalists who think that their expertise and their journalism over the years some way has qualified them to write fiction. And they haven't really thought seriously through the process of writing fiction before they actually started writing fiction. So once I began actually writing the fiction, I not only discovered how appallingly ill-equipped I was to write fiction, but I began to get very engaged very quickly with learning about how you start thinking about writing fiction. And I found myself captivated by that process. And I was helped inordinately by having an agent who oversaw a lot of the process of the writing and forced me into rewrites. And that's possibly the greatest lesson that I took away from fiction writing, is that the real work gets done in the rewrite. The sort of voice of the book and the real shape of the book ends up coming clear in rewrite, not in first draft. And so the process of getting forced into rewrite by agents, then by commercial editors that you pay to read your manuscript and who come back with long, detailed appreciations of your manuscript, rewriting again on the basis of that, and then if you finally succeed in getting a publishing deal, rewriting again for the publishers because they will have their own. So Night Heron went through 4 major rewrites. Spy Games only went through 1 because I had agreed a lot in advance with the publisher about how it was going to work. But this rewrite process was something that, as a journalist, was completely alien to me. I don't rewrite. I file, I throw away, I forget, I move on to the next thing. So that was just one aspect of starting to figure the process out. So it was, it was a much larger transition than I had envisaged. And the thing also that I didn't know was that if you write a non-fiction book as a journalist, you're likely to get a publishing contract on the basis of a couple of chapters and a synopsis. That doesn't work in fiction. You have to write the whole novel because everyone wants to see how it ends, obviously, because that's the most important thing about a novel. So nobody will look at you unless you've got an entire finished 100,000 words of manuscript in fiction writing. So the whole process is very different to non-fiction. And I wasn't ready for it, and I'm still struggling to get comfortable with it.
When I read Night Heron, I was sort of surprised that there was a spy novel set in China, because most of us are used to sort of the Le Carré and Europe and the Cold War and the Soviet Union and all that stuff. And yet, looking at all, China's doing in Africa, as you described, what the tensions between the U.S. and China, and cyber security issues, and all these conflicts. I realized I was a little surprised that there isn't like a whole genre out there already of books. Why do you think we're still doing spy books, mostly sort of Europe and the West, and not so much in China and Asia?
It's a great question. And the publishers don't know the answer to it either. And Little Brown decided that Night Heron was going to be their attempt at the China spy novel. So, the marketing shtick for Night Heron was, here it is, you've been waiting for the China spy novel. No, we found it. The truth is that China books are a difficult sell. That's true in non-fiction and in fiction. There are a few hugely successful books about China that have done terribly well in the West, but the fact they are exceptions that prove the rule. Most books on China struggle to make an impact for publishers in terms of sales. They often do very well in terms of reviews and prizes, and but in the commercial reality of publishing, they often don't do terribly well. China fiction is hard because I think most even literate and educated Western people have not been exposed very much to Chinese history. The names are very hard to follow. Pinyin romanization is extremely difficult to follow. Even if you've studied Chinese, it's difficult to make sense of. I think it just looks like a big and alien and bleak and forbidding place, and people don't feel comfortable leaping into it. Most people don't have terms of reference. If you think about Russia, even if you've never studied Russia, we're culturally familiar with the broad outlines of Russian history and Russian culture. People are not familiar with those broad outlines of China still, even today. The truth is, there is a vast espionage story, real-life espionage story taking place between China and the United States. It's very compelling. It's very exciting. Some of the cases will astonish you. We know less about what's happening, there they are now. We know less about how we spy on China, though we know it happens. We get occasional references in the Chinese media to high-level spy cases. There was one just a couple of years ago. High-level guy in the Ministry of State Security found spying for the CIA. We know very few details about it, but we know it does happen. Edward Snowden has told us a lot about how we run signals intelligence against China. But it does feel to me like a vein to be mined, which is indeed what I'm trying to do.
Great. Let's open it up to the floor. If you have a question, are we going to have mics, Brandon? Great. So wait for the mic. I'll recognize you. Wait for the mic. Identify yourself briefly and ask or make a brief comment, not a speech, please. So we'll start with you, sir. Right here, Brandon.
Thank you. Hi, Adam. I'm Joe Cirincione, and I think Fox News is trying to control my brainwaves. But that's not what I want to talk to you about. I loved Night Heron. Some of the scenes are still with me, just beautiful, vivid writing. But while you're here, I want to talk to you about Chinese investment in Ethiopia. Are they making a profit from this? Is this working for them? And is the Ethiopian attitude grateful or resentful?
I simply can't give you an answer on profit. I don't know. Most of these major projects seem to be vendor financed, so you'd think the Chinese side has probably figured out in advance how it's going to work. Is it working to China's advantage? I guess it depends how you define what they're trying to achieve. I mean, strategically, they certainly seem to be achieving something. Their presence is huge, and they are now deep into the infrastructure of East Africa. Ethiopians were very impressed, by and large, I found, the ones I spoke to, in a totally unscientific sampling, very impressed at the degree of commitment that the Chinese were bringing, their ability to move big infrastructure projects forward very, very quickly. The way it was put to me by one guy in Addis was, if you seek funding from the European Union to build a dam project or any kind of water project, you have to fill out a 160-page environmental impact statement. And that is going to take you a year, probably. The Chinese don't have an environmental impact statement. They will just come and build your hydraulic project, whatever it may be. And they'll do it in 6 to 8 months with Chinese engineers on site, directing operations. The speed and power of what they do is very, very striking. There is concern that the EPRDF, the ruling party in China, is selling Ethiopia out. Is selling Ethiopia out to China. They're particularly among kind of the leftist pro-democracy activists that you encounter among kind of the Addis intelligentsia. There's suspicion about the links between the Ethiopian elite and the Chinese elite. But by and large, people are using their Huawei cell phones, and their Huawei cell phones are transforming their lives in the villages. You know, it's one of these things where you no longer have to depend on a middleman to find out your prices of what you're growing. You could call the market NADIS from your village. You could find out what the prices are, and you can make your own decisions about how much to sell and when to sell it. And that is transformative for rural agriculture. So generally, I think I found that there's a high level of support for the Chinese presence. That was my tinged with suspicion and a sense that this thing could get out of control was my broad sense.
So the gentleman in the back there.
You mentioned how big a gap there is between fiction and nonfiction, and surely the agents know that. Can you say a bit more about how you managed to connect with such a good fiction agent?
This agent had actually never done any commercial fiction. She's largely a publisher of very elevated academic work, and she does some popular nonfiction. She did a book. She did The Hare with Amber Eyes. I don't know if you know that book, a very successful book about art. And she does young adult fiction, so she does a lot of kids' books. But this was her first venture into adult commercial fiction. She had never published a spy novel before. So was this wise of her to take me on? I don't know. We're enjoying the ride. She's still with me. So she tells me that she's learning the business too as she goes. But it's something she says she wants to do more of. How do you connect with a good agent? I have to come clean and just tell you it was a friend of a relative. It was a personal connection. And often that's the way it'll work. That gets you in the door. It doesn't get you any further than that. Agents don't do favors for relatives or friends of relatives. That personal connection lasts as long as the first 3 pages of your manuscript, basically, which is what an agent will read. And they'll know fundamentally in that time whether they're interested in your manuscript or not. One way that a lot of people are now connecting with agents, which seems to be a very useful way of doing it, is these pitching sessions at literary festivals. A lot of agents go, a lot of influential agents go, they sit in a room for a day, and you get 10 minutes. You book an appointment, and you get 10 minutes to pitch. And they sit and they listen, and people are getting contracts through this, and it's happening quite a lot. And it will often be the only time that you get to sit face to face with a powerful and influential literary agent and actually look in the eye and say, this is why you need to pay attention to my writing. But I'm hearing a lot of people say that that's a very good way of going about it these days.
Brennan, did you still have a question?
Maybe.
Well, do you or don't you?
Okay.
So, right here.
I didn't know a microphone would be involved. Hey, I'm Michael. I just had a quick question. I was wondering if you found that the genre was somewhat freeing versus journalism, where you have to maintain journalistic integrity and everything. I think you said you were sort of...
No, I never used to worry about that too much.
No, okay, well then never mind. But, I wonder if you found that you could say more, in other words. And I think, there was the famous French, sort of considered like a dime store
liberating
spy novelist who died. I don't know if you know who I mean.
Yeah, it was really, really liberating, and it was wonderful to be free of strictures of daily journalism. So, and as I said, it ended up being a learning process that I had, through my own naivety and lack of foresight, had not envisaged that it would be. And that's perhaps been the most exciting part of it, is really just trying to figure out the mechanics of a whole new craft. It's a completely different craft, and it's one that I find myself really very engaged in and drawn to. Yeah.
This gentleman here. Blue. Well, actually, why don't you go? So, sir, you're here in the second row.
I was thinking of, Steve Winters, thinking of your remark about the African Union building. I seem to have this vague memory that the original plans for that were thrown out because the local Africans thought it was too much like a Shanghai building, and that what they came up with was something that was supposed to reflect traditional African architecture, which is this idea, this sort of hut-like structure. So I gather it didn't work for you. It still looks like Shanghai.
It's supposed to look like a hut. That's right. Do you want me to look at this again and see how much we think it looks like a hut? Where is it? It's coming up. There it is. I think the dome was supposed to refer, as you say, architecturally to a traditional Ethiopian village, mud and wattle structure. So obviously that's the first thing that occurs to you when you look at this. I'm sure you're transported immediately to the plains of Oromia by that. Yeah.
Sir?
My name is Ed. At the beginning, you mentioned that BBC is so clean that spying and journalism never go hand in hand. Do you know any spies, real spies in journalism, and not BBC or some other? No.
Great question. Kim at the back may want to come in on that too. I bet she knows a few. It used to be the case that journalists were widely used by the intelligence agencies. Journalism is fantastic natural cover for a spy. You can be anywhere you want, meeting whomever you want, asking whatever questions you want at any time of day or night, and you have the perfect excuse for being there. That's what intelligence agencies call natural cover, and journalism is perfect. In the interwar period, the Comintern used journalism as cover a great deal. Journalists were spies all over the place. As post-war, as it got into the 60s, and as journalism became much more commercialized and much more popular, and the media industry grew, it began to dawn on people that the integrity of the media was actually something that mattered, not only for political and informational reasons, but for commercial reasons. And it started to dawn on executives in ABC News and CBS and places that it was a really bad idea if they sent their journalists out around the world and that people thought they might be spies. So agreements started to be reached between governments and the big media organizations that there would be a hands-off approach. And that, I think, from the 60s and 70s on, was pretty much the way it went. The BBC had a very explicit agreement with MI5 and MI6, the two British human intelligence agencies, that no BBC reporter would ever be recruited or used in an intelligence capacity. And that was an established written agreement, as I understand it. Out on the margins and fringes of journalism, in the freelance world, now, I'm told, those agreements are beginning to fall apart. And the intelligence agencies are in this new world of journalism where so many of the boundaries are broken down, affiliations have broken down, where you have websites and small media startups, and everyone's a freelance, and the old journalistic institutions are no longer dominant in the field. This agreement is, I'm told, starting to break down. You can look at something like a case that broke in China this past year as an indicator of how this might work. A newspaper in Guangdong in South China broke a story about a man named Li who was sentenced to 10 years in prison for espionage. He had been contacted by an internet user online, an internet user who called himself Feiger Online, which means flying brother. Feiger let it be known that he was in the market for information and suggested that it was journalism that he was dealing with. He commissioned this guy Li in Guangdong to go to subscribe to military and security journals in China, to hang out in military chat rooms on the Chinese internet, and relay back to Feiger online everything that he found. And Feiger paid this guy Li over the period of a couple of years for all the journalism and all the informal journalism that he could pick up online in China and send it back to whoever Feiger was. We don't know who he was. The Ministry of State Security investigated the case, and they found that Feiger had done the same thing with 40 people across China. He was running 40 local freelancer come agents online all through China, hoovering up enormous amounts of open source and semi-open source material and gossip and chat and stuff. That's the kind of world that we now inhabit. So journalists and people who think that they're freelancers and who are dealing with people that they never see over the net, websites that they never know who finances them or who owns them, clearly intelligence work is now bleeding back into mass media in a way that it didn't used to do, is my sense.
So the gentleman there has patiently had his hand up for a while.
Yeah, good evening, David Wiles. Adam, for your research, it just sounds like you did essentially open source research as you're developing your storylines. Did you ever have a, occasion or want or need to find a retired James Bond or something along those lines to get the inside?
Did I have one want?
Well, no, but just kind of the reality of the story, or did you just want to keep it in the fiction as you saw it versus matching some sort of reality, I guess?
So the question for the fiction writer is, how far does your imagined world seek to map or mirror or track reality? And do you need to do that? I mean, what are the imperatives here? Going into this, I thought the imperative would be realism, to map and track reality. In fact, I find that the greater imperative is the integrity of the fiction. That's what matters more to a successful piece of fiction. You can look at some novels, I'm not going to mention any names now, but you can look at some novels that map reality very closely, which don't work terribly well as novels. And you can look at John le Carré, who does not map reality terribly closely in, say, the way that SIS worked at the time when he was writing about it, but whose portrayal of a moment in intelligence history is so vivid and so powerful, it captures something so unique and so strange, and asks us enormous moral questions off the back of it, that you don't care whether it's real or not. George Smiley or somebody at that level in SIS would not be out doing street surveillance operations. That would not happen. Not then, not now. Le Carré makes you believe it can, and did. I spoke to a couple of former intelligence people, and I got them to read chunks of text where I was worried that what I was doing was simply too implausible or too difficult. And I got them to tell me, I asked them, does this make you choke when you read it? And I got a little bit of detail from one or two people about voice, about tone. And silly little details, like inside SIS, inside that crazy building on the south bank of the Thames in London, how do you have a meeting? How does it happen? Do you book a meeting room and everybody turns up, or do you just all turn up and knock on someone's door, or do you email, or what do you do? How do you have a meeting? Turns out you just turn up and knock on someone's door, and people bring in chairs and they all sit around and they have a cup of coffee and they talk, like any other corporate institution. That kind of detail I gleaned from talking to somebody who used to work there. I would like to talk more to people. I'm not convinced it's the most important thing I've got to do. I think there are other more important things in the working of the fiction than there are in talking to former intelligence officers. But for that kind of detail and for voice, tone of voice, it's obviously an important thing to do. Any volunteers? I am available. I'll be leaving my card distributed around me.
So we'll do here. Sorry.
I'm not volunteering for that, but Adam, listening to all the details you gave about Africa, in particular about Ethiopia, I'm wondering whether you're not worrying to become a journalist again. If you look at the state of journalism today, obviously the lack of resources and all this, being a freelance spy novelist is getting close to being an investigative journalist, is it not? and you may actually turn into a journalist at some point.
Heaven forfend. I think I'm done with that. I hope. No, I mean, I came out of that trip to Ethiopia realizing that I could have and probably should have written a big piece on China's place in Ethiopia, China's actions in Ethiopia. Do you know what? I sort of didn't want to do the hard work associated with it. I didn't want to go and answer Joe's question about, well, are the Chinese making a profit? I didn't want to go and sit and pile through mounds of stuff in Chinese about whether or not the Chinese railways are making a profit, which is the stuff I would have had to do if I was going to write proper, well put together investigative feature on. I wanted to leap into the imagining of it. I wanted to take those railway scenes and write a scene, which is in Spy Games, of my journalist walking around those deserted railways with the goats tethered in the sidings, and think about that world, which is a completely different thing to writing a piece of investigative journalism. I do think fiction, as I hinted at the end there, I think fiction has got popular commercial fiction, has got a really useful role to play in injecting ideas into popular discourse. Commercial fiction can, if it's done well, just make you think and introduce you to ideas it doesn't necessarily have. Sometimes it can be very specific. If you look at a movie like Blood Diamond with Leonardo DiCaprio, that had a very significant political effect, that film. And sometimes they do. It doesn't always happen by any means. But you can, I guess, mesh the journalist's function a little bit in the act of fiction writing. Please.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. I was wondering, this kind of follows on that question, and maybe you didn't want to go into it, but what is the strategic value of Ethiopia to China that I assume your story a little bit hinges on or explores?
In the end, I guess you'd have to ask someone in China who's thinking about it. It's not immediately clear. If you asked Ethiopians about it, they point to the fact that Ethiopia is a very powerful player in Africa, not only politically but culturally. Addis Ababa is the headquarters of the African Union. Every African country has an embassy in Addis Ababa. If you build a road in Addis Ababa, every embassy in Africa notes that China came and built the fabulous new road. If you build a mass transit system, every embassy, all the personnel and all the embassies see that the Chinese build fabulous mass transit systems. I got the strong sense that Chinese people and Ethiopians have a remarkable amount, politically and culturally and historically, in common, which is counterintuitive. But if you consider that both countries come out of ancient imperial systems, both countries have a very high degree of cultural exceptionalism. Both countries overthrew their emperors. Both countries had nasty skirmishes with colonialism without ever being fully colonized. And that's incredibly important to identity formation in both countries. Both countries had a Red Terror. Both countries are now looking for ways of taking large, very impoverished agrarian populations and turning them into something different. So the previous Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, wrote his PhD thesis on the Chinese economy. And there just seemed to me to be a lot of common ground there for Chinese people and Ethiopian people to talk about and to identify with in each other's history and cultures. The Chinese people I saw on the ground were very engaged and very kind of present in Ethiopia and were exploring, learning Amharic, and this whole new pidgin language was turning up on Chinese building sites, which was fascinating. It was part Mandarin, part Amharic, part English, and part sign language. And it's taking on people are learning it now on building sites in Ethiopia, and it's becoming a creole of its own, I'm told, by people who use it. So I felt that said a lot about why China's in Ethiopia. In the end, it speaks to China's One Belt, One Road strategy. It speaks to China's desire to be a bigger player in the Middle East. It speaks to China's desire to have a stable strategic foothold in Africa. I think there are probably people here who know much more about it than I do.
Gentleman back there. Back.
Thank you very much. My name is Herman. I'm a freelance. Your book strengthens my admiration to the BBC. Thank you very much. My question is, do you have any reference about China's experience right now with Japan? Because in the 80s, Japan was doing exactly like what China is doing now. At the time, they call it business intelligence. They send more business intelligence around the world, and that is the success behind the story of Toyota in the United States, Honda, and everything. My second question is that, is the emergence of China as economic power replace the model of Western model, which is, if you want to be a superpower, let's do it through war, and China is doing through extremely another way around. Thank you very much.
So Adam, can I just interject? We're going to try and wrap this up in a few minutes. Sure. But there I see a bunch of hands. So can I ask, I know this is kind of
move it through quickly. Yeah.
Kind of cutting you a bit short, but we're running out of time. So can I Brandon, we'll take your question, there's one more back there. So we'll take 4 questions and then Adam will synthesize and.
Okay.
Adam, are you still welcome in China? And are you going to be translating this book in Chinese?
And then Michael?
Michael Yehuda. In both books, you have quite a lot to say about how the British intelligence agencies thinks about China, thinks about issues. And I get the impression that underlying it is the view that they don't really want any change in the status quo. I think that comes out very strongly.
No spoilers, Michael, no spoilers.
And yet, they are regarded as subversive. So isn't that a little strange?
And then the gentleman back there.
Hi, thank you. I find it interesting that you have them starting in China for your first book. And the second book, you're in Africa. China's greatly involved in South America and Central America. I mean, you can look at the new canal that they're building there in Panama. Some people might say that many of the things that China's doing infrastructure-wise is more in response to a U.S. presence, trying to counter U.S. influence. So I'm just curious if you'll take your next book to South America, Central America. Thank you.
On the first gentleman's question, the business intelligence thing with comparison to Japan, I mean, I think nobody has ever done what China is doing now in terms of acquiring proprietary information worldwide. This seems to be an extraordinary effort, and we're not clear quite how big it is yet. If you are interested in the scope and the mechanics of this effort by China, then I point you towards work by James Mulvenon, just up the road here, who has written an important book called Chinese Industrial Espionage. And I point you also towards a guy called Tai-Ming Zheng out at the University of California at Riverside? Irving. San Diego, UC San Diego, who is assembling a very intricate and important picture of how China uses the information that it sucks up and takes back to China, and how it reverse engineers business intelligence into useful, practical intelligence inside China for commercial purposes. So we're starting to see people build a real picture of these structures, but we don't yet know just how enormous this Chinese effort is. In terms of Chinese development, China will tell you that they are a very, very peaceful nation and that their rise is peaceful and it will be peaceful. It's not looking quite so peaceful at the moment in the South China Sea. If you haven't watched the BBC's latest reporting on the South China Sea from the last 2 days, I urge you to look at the BBC's personal flyover of the Spratly Islands and the response from the Chinese Navy that they got as they did it, would I think give anybody the shivers who is concerned about security issues in the South and East China Seas. Am I welcome in China? I don't know. I mean, on the basis of being a journalist, I was never going to be very welcome back anyway, and getting a visa is hard. I'm not sure how welcome I am on the basis of the book. Is there a Chinese translation? No, none. I've got Polish, Italian, German, Serbian, Bulgarian, no Chinese. Japanese, there's the Japanese. Finnish, thank you. That's the Japanese version of Night Heron. Has a pair of handcuffs on the front. But no Chinese. Nobody has bitten from. It would never get translated in mainland China. But I was sort of hoping maybe Hong Kong or Taiwan, but not yet. Michael's question, SIS, the way that Britain and I think Europe thinks about China, you can tell me much more than I can tell you, Michael. But clearly one of the themes in Spy Games, in my second novel, is where do our strategic interests with China really lie? Do they lie with change in China, or do they lie with stability in China? And I'm inclined to feel that increasingly the UK envisages the Chinese Communist Party as the best bet for stability in China, and would probably commit strategically to that vision. And the notion that China will peacefully evolve into some sort of, liberal polity out of its economic development seems to be an idea that is slowly dying and if not already dead. On Latin America, well, I am going to Suriname for book number 3. I'm a little intimidated by going to Latin America because I know pitifully little about the continent and I don't speak Spanish. So even though, as you say, the projects that China is undertaking, particularly in Peru, particularly the transcontinental highways, the new port facilities in Peru, these are of enormous strategic significance and clearly mean a lot. And somebody should be examining them in an exciting fictional context. Just might not be me yet. Perhaps I'll get to that.
You could also consider going to Pacific Islands or
You can go pretty much anywhere, I think.
That's true.
And not necessarily come away feeling that this is some nefarious neo-colonial project. One can come away feeling that this is maybe something new, that we need to find new vocabularies and new terms to coin, to define, and to talk sensibly about.
Adam, thanks a lot for the very enjoyable, informative discussion. Thanks, everybody.